Okay, so welcome to tonight's presentation. My name is Amy Loving, and I'm here today to talk to you about what you can do for native bees, why native bees are important, and we're going to talk also about some of the habits of native bees, the differences between certain groups, and just sort of kind of dive in. And I'll be here to answer your questions as well. If you have a question, please feel free to stick it in the chat box. I will leave time at the end for questions as well. Or if you've got something that you're dying to know the answer to as we're going through here, feel free to just go ahead and pop in. We've got a small group here. There's only 8 participants, so please feel free to stop and ask those questions. Okay, so my name is Amy Loving. I work at a place called Nahant Marsh Education Center. For those of you who have not heard of us before, we are located in Southwest Davenport, just below the 280 bridge.
Chris, you should see this.
And we are a 305-acre wetland preserve. We have been doing education programming down here since 2000. And since then, we have grown in leaps and bounds over that short 21-year period. Later on in the month, there will be a presentation that we had to reschedule that will go over the history of Nahant Marsh. So if you're curious about that, we have a really long, interesting, rich history, and that would be a great one to attend. But our main 3 focuses down here are education, research, and conservation. And so I serve as the director of education here. And so that's my main goal, is to coordinate the programming down here. And we do everything from summer camps to field trips, continuing education, workshops, all sorts of fun things. And then on the research side of things, we do annual research. We do things like water testing. In the summer, we have summer interns that are working on turtle population studies, which is a presentation that you'll be having the opportunity to see later on. I think that one's next week. And so there's lots of research that goes on down here. And what's important about that research is that it's going to help us to guide us to manage the property in the best way and manage the preserve in the best way, so that we make sure that our restoration efforts are, we're putting our money where our mouth is, I guess you could say. And just the last thing I'll say about the center is that we are a unique partnership with the city of Davenport. So they actually own our education building and some of the preserve, but it's all protected and all managed by Nahant Marsh, a nonprofit board. So they oversee the management of the property, and the city helps with things if things break down in the building. And we also have our education partner with Eastern Iowa Community Colleges, and I actually and my director work for the colleges, and we serve as the executive director and director of education for the Marsh. All right, moving along. So we're here tonight to talk about bees, and why should we care about bees? Now, I know a lot of people kind of are fearful of bees. Maybe they had a bad experience as a child, maybe they're allergic, but we're going to kind of look at the good side of bees and try to hopefully debunk any myths that you have about them. So bees are really the best pollinators. There's a lot of pollinators out there. You've got other kinds of insects, things like butterflies and wasps and ants. Some mammals like bats are also pollinators. Sometimes birds can be considered pollinators, but really bees are the most effective pollinators. And this is because they collect pollen for a reason, and that is to feed their young. And they also have these really hairy bodies, so that makes them really effective at carrying the pollen from flower to flower. And they're going to carry the pollen in 2 different ways. So you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor on the screen here. So on this big black bee here on the yellow flower, you can notice how the pollen is sort of dusted all over the abdomen and throughout the lower legs and up to even on the thorax and part of the head. So that's more of like a dusting. So that's one way that they can carry pollen. Another way is if we look up here in the corner, we've got this bumblebee with this nice little pocket of orange pollen that it's carrying there. And the bee, actually, the bumblebees and honeybees will actually move their legs kind of in a circular motion to create that ball of pollen there. So when we think about bees, most people think about honeybees. That's typically what comes to folks' mind. They think about honeybees, they think about a big beehive, about beekeepers, but honeybees are actually not native to North America. They are native to Europe and were brought over here during settlement. And honeybees population are in decline along with our native bees. And this is because of many reasons. There's habitat loss, herbicide and pesticide use, commercial farming of honeybees and also bumblebees has led to disease breakouts, toxins. So there are a lot of factors that lead into the decline in not only honeybees, but native bees and bumblebees as well. And of course, honeybees produce honey. Our native bees do not produce honey. And one of the important things we want to point out about native bees is that they have evolved with the native plants that we have here, our native forest and prairie and wetland plants. And some of these plants are specifically need certain kinds of bees to pollinate them. That is how they have evolved. And they have evolved to attract a certain kind of bee to their flower so they can make seed. And native bees are also solitary nesters for the most part. Now, bumblebees are social nesters, and we'll get into that in a moment here. But by and large, our native bees are solitary nesters. So this means that they're going to be less susceptible to disease and pests. So when we think about on a commercial level, our honeybees that are commercially farmed and our bumblebees that are commercially farmed, they are going to be in these huge groups. If there is a disease or an outbreak of some kind, that's going to spread rather quickly. And, you know, we're kind of living in those times right now, aren't we? Okay. So diversity. There are over 4,000 species of bees in North America, and they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So the photo here on the left shows the smallest bee in North America. And this is, I think the measurement was 0.08 inches is the smallest measurement of a bee. And the largest bee is about 1¼ inch long. So quite a difference in the size of bees. And bees, many of them can be mistaken for wasps. Wasps can be mistaken for bees. There's also mimics and flies. There's many flies that look very similar to bees. They have the black and white striping. So sometimes it can be really hard to distinguish one from the other because many of them are going to be on maybe the same plants, pollinating and gathering nectar. And bumblebees are actually my favorite group of bees. We're going to get into the groups of bees here in just a moment. We're going to go through our 5 major families of bees. We won't dive too much into taxonomy, but if you've got questions about that, please feel free to let me know. Oh, looks like we have somebody in the chat. Let me get them in real quick. All right, welcome to those who have just joined us. So we're going to start diving right into the life cycles of our native bees. We're going to get into our 5 large families, and then we're going to kind of round out the rest of the presentation with some things, actionable items that you can do to help our native bee populations. Okay, so this is a good image. It's a little fuzzy, but I did want to show you the difference between bees and wasps, because often I hear, and even still from my own husband that I've tried desperately to educate, that bees and wasps are different creatures. If you look at the taxonomy, they are very closely related, but they are two different creatures. Okay, they are in different groups entirely. And one of the ways you can tell the difference, some easy ways, is so the two wasps, two insects on the left of the screen, these ones are going to be our wasps. And I want you to notice that mostly wasps tend to have like a cinched waist there between the thorax and the abdomen. So that's the center part and the lower part here. And have a cinched waist or sometimes a very elongated one. And they also tend to have longer, more like spindly legs. And if you look at the leaves or the wings, they tend to have more of a folded look to them. Another thing too is about the coloration. Now, this is not always the case, but by and large, wasps tend to be black and white, whereas, or black and yellow, where our bees are going to vary between more of a dark brown, tans, and yellows versus being entirely black. So that's not always the case, but that is one thing that can kind of help us at a quick glance tell the difference between the two. Okay, so we have the life cycle of bumblebees here. I have a soft spot for bumblebees. They are my favorite group of bees. They are an early emerging bee, and they have a pretty interesting life cycle. So similar to the honeybee, they are going to nest socially, but they do it in a much different manner. So the basic life cycle of the bee is that in the winter, or as fall is approaching and cold times are approaching, a newly incubated queen is going to find a place to burrow for the winter. She's going to stay in that burrow until temperatures rise in the spring, and that's usually around this time of year. And she's going to come out of the burrow. She's going to be very hungry. She's going to start foraging on any early blooming plants. Now, you may have seen a lot of things like on Facebook, leave the dandelions for the bees. And that's a good thing, but there's other things, some of our native tree species especially, that are very important pollinator sources for our early emerging bees. So the queen bee will go out and she will forage. She will come back to the nest site. She will then create what's called bee bread. And this bee bread is a combination between pollen and nectar. And she's going to place that bee bread inside a little wax pot. So you can see that in the image here. She creates these little wax pots in which she lays her eggs, incubates them, and then caps them off. Now, once that egg hatches out, that bee bread that's put in there, that mixture of pollen and nectar, is going to be the food source for that larva. So it's going to eat on that. It's going to then pupate, and then it's going to emerge. So the first ones that are going to emerge are going to be females. So she's going to lay a whole bunch of females, and then she's going to lay a whole bunch of males. And those females and males are going to take over for the rest of the summer foraging for the nest. So she is no longer going to be going out and foraging. She's going to be staying in the nest, laying and incubating eggs. And now towards the end of the summer, she's going to have her last brood, which is going to contain only queens, only bees that will become queens. The males will die, so the new queens will have to find mates before they go and hibernate. The newly mated queens will hibernate for the rest of the winter, and all the other bees will die. So that's the life cycle of the bumblebee. When I first learned about this, I never would have thought it was so, there was so much going on with it. And it's incredible to know that this is all happening underground and we're not seeing that. So There are some things that you can do to encourage bumblebees to nest in your yard if that's something that you're interested in, and I'm going to go over that in a while here. But one of the main things about taking action for native bees and pollinators, insects in general, is going to be just providing habitat and food sources. So we'll dive into that a little bit more later on. I'm going to double check we don't have anybody waiting in our wait list. Okay, we're good. Oh, let me go back here. Okay. So I mentioned solitary nesting earlier. So this is 90% of our wild bees are solitary nesters. And by and large, they're going to be nesting in cavities in dead trees, in the ground, in hollow plant stems. So as we look at this image here, this gives us an idea of what it looks like to be a solitary nester. And I really find it interesting the way that these, the leafcutter, the resin bee, and the mason bee have their nesting site. So leafcutter bees, they get their name because that is how they're going to line their nest. They actually go out with their little mandibles and they cut out circles. And you can see this if you've ever been on a trail anywhere and you saw the edges of a leaf cut out into what looks like these perfect little circles. That's the leafcutter bee. You know that you've got them there if you can find that evidence. And they are very common. They usually are going to start nesting in June, July. So you can look for them there at that time. But this is going to be what their nesting site looks like. So I want to point out that what they do is they make these little rooms, right? And they go into this hollowed stem. They put in their bee bread, which for anybody who joined us afterward, our bee bread is our combination between our pollen and the nectar, and they make that into a little ball. They place it in there, they lay their egg, and then depending on which kind of bee it is, they're going to go out and try to find something to finish off that egg's room. So the resin bee uses resin and that it gathers from trees. The mason bee is going to go gather soil, and they do this by gathering it in their mouth, and that's what they're going to line their nest with. So it's just really interesting, I think, to think about all the work that these busy bees go into for their nesting sites. It's all happening inside and underground. So this is an example of one type of solitary bee house that you could put in your backyard. There are different ways to do this, but this is just one of the methods there. So I wanted to point this out. This is a good example of that leafcutter bee and cutting out that really perfect circle there. And look at it, zooming back to the nest. I just think that that's so awesome to see. I wish I could photograph something like that myself. Okay, and so this is just another example. Kind of reiterating here exactly what we're looking at for this solitary kind of cavity nester bee. So we've got our bee balm, our bee bread, our egg, larva, pupa, and then it's emerging as an adult and going and gathering pollen. Any questions so far? And feel free to unmute yourself regarding the life cycles of some of our native bees. I know that's a lot of information to throw at you, but if you've got any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and let me know.
Hello, I have a question.
Sure.
When I was a kid, we used to catch bees. There were so many bees. We had a certain plant in front of our house that was pink, and I don't know what it was, but it was bulbous looking, and the bees loved it. So we just had thousands of them in front of our house. I don't see them like I used to when I was a kid, and it kind of freaks me out and makes me sad. Is part of it part of all the pesticides we're using even on our lawns? Not to blame just farmers, but just all the pesticides we use. Is that part of it?
That's definitely part of it. And I think another thing in, more of an urban setting is that, when you go to your local nursery, lawn and garden center, they're by and large not selling plants that are native to our area, or they're selling plants that are just not food sources for the bees. So there's no reason for the bees to come and forage if they don't have the food sources that are there. So of course, using, pesticides on your lawn can definitely affect not just the bees, but all the other insects as well. And so if it gets to the point where you've sort of got this barren landscape and it's just lawn with not a lot of other flowering plants, you're not going to see a lot of insects. So,
Hey,
for
Amy,
example,
one
I
last
live in
thing.
sorry, go ahead.
Amy, is there a listing on your website or something on the native plants or something that they would like to eat? Because I've got the barren yard right now, and I would like to put in some things that bees like.
Yeah, so I actually have a slide on that I'm going to go over, and I'm going to give you guys some resources to find good places to source your native seed and or plants, and then also some valuable resources too. So yeah,
Okay,
absolutely. That's, I'm glad you asked that. Any other questions right now? Nope. Okay, we'll keep going here. There we go. Okay. So one of our first emerging families of bees is our cellophane bees, or the collet family. And don't worry, I won't test you on the taxonomy later. But these bees, like we said, 90% of them are solitary ground nesters. They, if we're looking at them description wise, they are moderately hairy, mostly on the head and the thorax. There is some hairs on the abdomen there and the legs too, but mainly it's kind of like in these, on the abdomen, it's more, the hair's more on the white bands there. And then they also have fairly hairy legs as well. So where there is more hair, there is more opportunity for that pollen dust to stick. So we can see that in the picture above in the top right-hand corner, where that little cellophane bee is foraging on a plant called nodding onion. So this is a wild native onion that is going to bloom early in the year. Another favorite another favorite food for this particular bee are things like red maple, willow, prairie clover, and lead plant. So they are going to be foraging really year round, but if you're a bee that wants to forage on trees and you sort of specialize in that, you're going to be foraging earlier in the growing season. And it is called the cellophane bee because it uses its saliva to line the nest. So if we remember back to the solitary nesting photos, this one, because it goes in the ground, it's going to be kind of like the picture of the mining bee, where it's going to tunnel down and then have these little like rooms off to the side. And it's going to line its nest with its saliva. And that's going to protect the nest from potential disease. It's going to help to waterproof the nest. So that's going to provide, hopefully optimal conditions for their eggs to survive. Oh, sorry, my clicker's not working right here. Okay, so our next group of bees is the Adrena family, or mining bees. So similar nesting habits as the collets. They going to be on the ground, but I love the picture of this bee. Look how much pollen that is dusted on this bee. And that is a early blooming tree or shrub that it is foraging on right now, because we can kind of see that woody stem there. But they are very hairy, so where there is hair, there will be pollen, and they're going to be covered with gold, yellow, light, and light gray hair. And now remember, we've got 4,000 species of bees in the United States. Some are going to be found all over the United States. Some of them are going to be, or in North America rather, some of them are going to be more Eastern species or Western species. So we're not going to get into the specifics of what actual species this is. We just know that these are certain characteristics of these particular families of bees. Another unique characteristics is sometimes the males can have a mustache. And where some of these bees collect pollen also helps to identify what family they may be in. And sometimes that's all you need to know, is what family that they're in. So we're not worrying about anything research grade here. And I'm going to talk about some citizen science stuff, but just kind of know that these are just some simple tricks that if you want to start documenting the things that are coming to your yard or to your local preserve, these are just some tricks that you can remember, make note of. So the pollen is actually collected on their hind legs, as you can see, and then sometimes up into what's called like the armpit of their leg. But again, can be really all over because they are a rather hairy bee. And they, similar to the mining or to the cellophane bee, they're going to also line their nest with saliva, which is really just a secretion from a special gland. So they favorite foraging favorite things to forage on are wildflowers, trees, shrubs, and they are one that buzz pollinates. So they will sort of vibrate their body as they pollinate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our bumblebees. There we go. So this is our green or our metallic green sweat bees, Halictidae family. Another solitary ground nesters. They tend to have bright green heads and thorax. However, this family, there's a lot of different species of bees that are referred to as sweat bees. And they come in a variety of colors and sizes. So this is not always what they're going to look like. Sometimes they're all black. They tend to have some sort of metallic shade to them, but that's not always the case. And sometimes people in the summer, you may notice that you're having, bees landing on you when you're out at a picnic or out at the park, and they are landing on you and licking your sweat. They're trying to get the salts from you. So they tend to collect pollen on the lower hind of their leg. They nest in these kind of more flat, loamy sand soils along the edges of fields, and they are a generalist. So what does that mean? So animals are either generalists or they're specialists, and that means that they will, as a generalist, you are not too particular about, either something like your food source or where you're going to take shelter, nesting sites. You're going to be kind of game for anything as long as it meets your basic needs. So that's a generalist. So they're going to forage on many, many different types of plants. Typically, things in the aster family, which is the biggest family of plants, and they're going to be active during summer and autumn. So the times that some of these bees are active also can point us in the right direction, at least kind of narrowing down what family they may be in, if that's something you're interested in learning about and doing. Megachiday. These are our really cool nest builders. So these are the ones that are going to nest above ground and below ground, but usually in wood, like dead trees, decaying trees that have some hollow areas in them, or in stems. They have a lot of dense hair below their antenna. Their pollen tends to collect on the underside of the abdomen. So that's a telltale sign for me. If I see a bee where the chunk of the pollen is collected under the abdomen and on the side of the abdomen, I know that it's probably a Megachiday. They, depending on what group they're in, they're going to nest in a variety of places. So underneath this particular family, there are, hundreds of different species of bees. And they tend to come out a little later than some of the other bees. They nest a little bit later than some of the other bees. And part of that is because of what they are wanting to forage on and what they're adapted to foraging on. So fruit trees and wildflowers mainly. And the last family I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to dive into some actionable items here, is the Apidae family. So this is going to include our bumblebees, cuckoo bees, and carpenter bees. So Up in the top right corner, that is a picture of a bumblebee I took a couple summers ago, and super common bee. In the eastern United States, we have 21 species of bumblebee. So those ones are actually, if you want to start to kind of get into learning how to identify some of the bees that might be visiting your garden or your landscaping, bumblebees is a really good place to start and an easier place to start because you can kind of narrow it down a lot easier. But they are social nesters. We went over that earlier in the presentation. They buzz pollinate. So what that means is when they go to a flower, they're going to vibrate that flower. Now that's important because there are certain flowers that will not release its pollen until it is vibrated. So one of those is the tomato plant. So there is an up close picture of the tomato flower. And what that bee has to do is it grabs a hold of the central portion of that flower, and the little spurs on its feet are going to grab a hold of that, and it's going to sort of chew the flower a bit and start to buzz, and that vibration is going to signal to the flower that it needs to open up that central tube there and release its pollen. And so that pollen is then going to dump on the thorax and abdomen of the bumblebee. It's going to then use its little legs and put it in some circular motions and make their little pollen ball basket there on their hind leg. So yes, these ones are an early emerging pollinator, and that is partly because of some of the adaptations they have, and that the vibration helps to keep their body warm. And also they are extremely hairy and fuzzy. So that's going to help to protect them in the cooler season. And we talked about their nests, and generally they'll forage anything, but there are certain plants that need them. But they can forage anything, but certain plants really need them specifically. So another ones include eggplants, peppers, blueberries, cranberries. There are certain bees that have to pollinate your squash in order for your squash to grow. So these things are all can be so specialized without us even knowing it. Any questions about our plant families before I move on to some of our actionable items? Okay, not hearing any, I'll go ahead and go forward. So one of the things that you can do is to protect existing nesting habitat. So if you've got a yard that you've got some leaf litter on, maybe you've got a property where you've got a little acreage and you have some down logs or dead trees, leave those things there. I know that we're sort of trained in our society to make things look very neat and tidy, and that's a good thing, but it's not just the bees, it's other beneficial insects as well. Moths a lot of times will hibernate in the leaf litter, and other butterflies, they actually pupate over winter in the leaf litter. So leaving some of these things be and just letting them be there is going to be beneficial to the other insects. So sometimes when we're talking about taking action for bees or pollinators or insects in general, a lot of times it's just give yourself a break. You don't need to have everything so neat and tidy. And leave some of those perennial stems. There's no need to cut them down. They're going to provide habitat through winter. And it's not just bees that are going to be nesting in some of those native plant stems. There's going to be a lot of other insects that are going to pupate inside of those plant stems. So you can leave those things there. Leaving areas of bare soil, that seems kind of counterintuitive, especially if you have, you live in a neighborhood where everybody has a nice, beautiful, green, lush lawn. Well, there's a place in your backyard, or you live near a creek or stream and you've got a slope, leave some areas of bare soil there. Those are going to be great places for those ground nesters to have their nesting sites. So some other things is try to prevent any soil disturbance or compaction if you can do that. And if you've got some acreage where you do have some wildflowers growing and you've started, you know, any small restoration project, or you've got, you know, decent area where you've been able to plant some pollinator habitat, you can try to do a prescribed burn if that works for your site. So we burn our prairies here at Nahant, usually in the fall and winter, and we cycle through which areas that we burn. So this one of the simplest things you can do, of course, is plant native plants. Plant the food that they are going, plant it and they will come. So remove invasive species. If you need help identifying what are maybe some common invasive species that can occur in your yard, let me know. I'm happy to send out resources. Right now I'm seeing one thing, the Callery pears are blooming. They're the decorative trees that are blooming right now with these big white flowers, and they're super pretty, but they're highly invasive. Invasive species are just going to take away habitat and resources from our native species and can oftentimes create a monoculture. And when we think about, you know, our roadsides, our nature preserves, we don't want a monoculture in those areas. We want diversity of plants, because the more diverse plants that you have, the more diverse insects, and on. It goes up the food chain and around the food web. So want to make sure that you purchase plants that are native to your area and region. Sometimes you'll find things that say, oh, well, this is a coneflower, but it's not a native species. And you know, some of our purists will say, you know, you've got to purchase things that are absolutely native to this area that are not cultivars. And most of the nurseries, big nurseries, are selling cultivars. You want to choose plants that are going to bloom from spring to fall, so that our bees and other pollinators have food sources all year round. You want to make sure that you plant butterfly and other larval host plants. Things like dill are good for our swallowtails. There's also even certain trees that are host to different butterflies. I've got a whole presentation on that. I'm happy to provide that if anybody's interested. And then provide an area where you can get some shallow water and make sure that you're changing that out. One thing you can do is, if you've got a bird bath or an area that you want to put a little bit of shallow water in, line that with either some rocks or marbles, so that there's not a place for any insects to drown in there. So I mentioned this earlier that, you know, I see often this time of year, leave the dandelions alone. They're a pollinator source, and they absolutely are. But there are so many other things that are blooming right now that our native pollinators can forage on. So most of these, a lot of them are going to be tree related, but there's a lot of flowers too. So if you're interested in changing out some of the trees you have in your yard, red maples are a good option. Willows, oaks are amazing for all insects. Virginia waterleaf, which is a woodland plant that's blooming right now. Bloodroot is another woodland plant. Wild geranium, violets. So if you have any of these things growing in your yard, or you happen to be out hiking in, you know, Loud Thunder or Wildcat Den, look at the flowers that are blooming right now, because there are some of our spring ephemeral woodland flowers that are blooming, and you're bound to see some of these bees on those plants. Okay, hold on a second here. There we go. So what are some things that you can plant? A good option, and I've got, I think, 3 slides of plants. Some good options are things that are going to be more generalist and that are going to have rather long bloom times. So the previous slide kind of went over what's blooming now, early season. And then once we start to get into May, June, July, August, September, you're going to have different things that are blooming. So one of the things that I think is really beautiful, and I should also preface this with, I try to choose names of plants that don't grow too tall. I know one thing that I hear and that I've seen is that when folks go and they want to plant native plants, well, they don't think about the fact that some of the plants they are choosing may be 6 to 8 feet tall. And you may not want to grow that in the front of your house or in the back of your house. So if this is something where you want to provide, you know, a touch here or there added into your landscape, these are things that won't get any higher than about 3 feet. And some of them are going to have a nice like bushy shape to them. So those are all things that you want to kind of consider when you're looking at planting a native plant, is that, you know, there's kind of this fine line between it being kind of that wild look and also being nice enough that your neighbors aren't going to roll their eyes at you. So purple coneflower is a great choice. There's the pale purple coneflower, the gray coneflower. I like this particular species because it's, to me, a more attractive species, especially in a landscape setting. And it is going to provide beautiful blooms kind of in, usually start mid-June into July. We've also got butterfly weed. This one is obviously going to be a host plant for the monarch butterfly, as it is a milkweed. Does not tend to spread as much as the common milkweed. So this is kind of what I would consider a good alternative for a nice, tidy landscape setting. It's going to create this nice kind of bushy plant, and it's going to attract a wide variety of insects and pollinators. Another great one that's more of an early bloomer is the golden Alexander. So this has these umbel flowers. It's in the parsley family, actually, and it's because it's in the parsley family. This is also one that's actually going to be a host site for the swallowtail butterfly larva. So the swallowtail butterflies will actually lay their eggs on this particular plant. So when the eggs hatch, they have their food. The caterpillar has their food source right there. So this is also another one that's beneficial to all sorts of insects. And I tried to include all of the plants that are in here so that they're not just focusing on only bees. Another good one is mountain mint. This one has these nice little white flowers. It grows kind of in another kind of a nice bushy plant, and it attracts a ton of different insects. This is a member of the mint family, and so it does have some medicinal properties. It smells very spearminty and was used by Native Americans and early pioneers as medicine, a source of tea. So it's got that benefit for us as well. One in the center here is hoary vervain. So just kind of thinking about, as we're, wanting to plant stuff that's going to be beneficial, what are things that are going to look different too? You've got some more like wide open flowers. You've got some more that are going to be more spiky or racine. And so you want to kind of diversify the look of things too, and the color of things too. Stiff goldenrod is here on the right-hand side, and goldenrod, sometimes folks confuse it with ragweed because it blooms at the same time as ragweed does. And a lot of people have issues when it comes to ragweed, but the goldenrod does not cause you your allergy issues in late summer. It is the ragweed. This particular species of goldenrod is more of a shorter species. It likes more of a drier area. So that's one of the reasons, kind of shorter growing. And so I think this is a good option for doing like a native garden. All right, and I think this is my last slide on our highlighting different species of flowers here. So New England Aster is a nice option. This is going to be a late bloomer. So the New England Aster and all of our Solidagos, our goldenrods, those are going to be huge foraging resources for our bees that are getting, our queen bees that are getting ready to hibernate over winter, and especially great food sources for the migrating butterfly, the monarch. So these are very important to have in any native garden setting, I think. Now, the one thing I will say about New England Aster is it does get rather tall. So if you're considering planting this particular one, just keep that in mind. Another one of my favorites is wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa. This is another member of the mint family and is sometimes called bee balm. It is beloved by bees and butterflies as well. Has these funny little tubular flowers. And this one comes, there's different varieties of wild bergamot. Some are these like scarlet red color, but this, the Monarda fistulosa is the native species. This one also has medicinal uses in case you're curious about that. It can be used as a culinary herb. It smells very similar to oregano. So during some summer camps here, I always have the kids, we chop up some of the leaves with that and we put them in biscuits and we put them in the solar bake oven and make wild bergamot biscuits for our edible classes. Last one here is the meadow blazing star, Liatris, and this is another really good kind of later season foraging resource for all of our butterflies and bees and pollinators. Okay, so where can we buy native plants from? So one place that I really like is the Prairie Moon Nursery, and they are located, I think it's Minnesota is where they ship from. And right now, their stock is probably pretty low. You kind of have to put in early orders with them. So you could certainly check to see what they have. But that's one resource there. If you do buy native seed, one word of warning is that native plants, native flowers, they have to go through stratification or scarification. And what that means is that when they fall off the plant in the fall, or in the winter, they have to go through a long period of being cold for a certain amount of time. You know, it could be 2 to 3 months. So if you buy native seed, you want to make sure that it's been stratified. Another thing is sometimes native seed has to be digested by another animal, and that kind of scratches up the surface of the seed and allows it to germinate. So keep that in mind if you decide to buy seeds. Make sure that they've already been stratified and they're prepped and ready to go for you. Another option is, I just found this place, the Blooming Prairie. It's a local, or small, I should say, kind of family-owned place, started by a hobbyist who was just really interested in growing native plants. Another option is Ion Exchange. I've gotten some flowers from there before, and they're a good resource. And then locally, you can support, there's a local group called the Guardians of the Prairie and Forest. They're a small grassroots group that support native plant or natural areas. They put on bio blitzes, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. But they have their native plant sale May 8th at the Hallberg Center in Rock Island. And I left the hours off of here, but it is from 10 to 4. So that would be another great option to try to find some native plants. And I personally like starting with plants first as opposed to seeds. To me, that's just, it's quicker is really what it comes down to, is I can just go ahead and grab it, plug it in, and I know that like we're good to go and I don't have to worry about killing off my seed. Okay, so what are some other things we can do to take action? So you could install a solitary bee house or construct a bumblebee nest. So the solitary bee house is the one with the tubes in there, and our bumblebee nest is down there on the bottom. It's really just a matter of putting a clay pot on the ground, kind of burying it a little bit, grabbing a hose or some sort of plastic tubing, and bringing it outside above ground, and hopefully your bumblebees will find that. Bumblebees tend to not be very aggressive, but I will say if they're nesting and you mess with their nest, be prepared. You might get stung. And so we do have a workshop coming up on May 18th. Myself and Allison, who's another naturalist here, she's a woodworker, and she's designing these these solitary bee houses. And we're going to construct those during the class and go on a bee hike, look at some of the bees that are foraging on the plants that are up, and end with going home with this cool bee nest. And typically, you know, if we put them out early enough, you hopefully, if you've got enough habitat around and foraging resources, that you might have bees nesting in it this year, but it may take another year. So you could also volunteer to remove invasive species at your local park or preserve. So those are good things to look for. If you go to Extreme Cleanup, Extreme is an organization that's a partnership of a few different agencies, but basically what they do is they help folks to coordinate whether that be trash pickup or invasive species removal along various areas. So you can look to participate in some of those options. We are actually hosting a spring cleanup here on May 1st, and it'll be a variety of removing invasive species and picking up any trash that has accumulated over the winter down here. Another cool option is to participate in community science. So there's all sorts of resources out there, and I could do an entire presentation on the different community or citizen science projects out there. But one that I really like that's easy for a novice is just download the iNaturalist app. It's a really good app that all you got to do is take a picture and it'll say, what did you see? And it will make a educated guess as to what you saw, whether that's a plant or an animal. And most of the time, it can get you down to at least the family and sometimes even the genus. So that's a cool thing, and it geolocates where you are. It also marks the date and the time. So if you want to start having kind of a keeping a phenology log of what you're seeing and when you're seeing it, you've got a resource right there on your phone, and it's free. There's also Bumblebee Watch and some other things, and those are places where if you want to really get into bees, you can go out and take as many bumblebee pictures as you want, upload it to Bumblebee Watch, and they will have an expert identify it for you, and scientists will use that data. So iNaturalist is also another one where if you've got enough confirmed IDs on whatever you took a photo of, that it will become research grade. So that's really a big deal. Scientists can't do it all. They need the help of the community. So we're doing a BioBlitz, helping to host one at Illinois Forest Preserve, and this is taking place on June 25th and 26th, or 25th and 26th. And a BioBlitz is basically a 24-hour snapshot of all living creatures that are at that site at that particular time. So this kind of helps to it helps those places to identify maybe areas of concern, helps us to discover new species that we didn't know were in those locations before, and just kind of generally contributes to the overall data collection of the plants and animals that are in our area. Another option would be to donate. There's lots of organizations here locally that that's what we do, is to protect native areas and to increase habitat, increase biodiversity. And so by supporting those organizations or going to your local native plant sales like the one I mentioned earlier, those are great ways to support too. So, and I'll kind of end this here, and hopefully we'll have a minute or two for questions. But so all these things, why do we do this? Well, we do this so that we can protect some of our endangered species. And this is a success story. So this particular bumblebee species, the rusty patched bumblebee, and you can see its little rusty patch outlined by the yellow there on its abdomen, is listed as federally endangered. And this was a bee that was fairly common not so long ago, but in recent years, there has been a huge decline, and people wondering, where did the rusty patched bumblebee go? Because it was so common to be found. It's a generalist, like most other bumblebees. You can find it in a lot of different habitats, backyards, gardens, woodlands. And so scientists are still not quite sure, like, what is it about this specific species of bumblebee that's in such a decline. And so they're still trying to figure that out. We actually have some research students. They're going to be out surveying our preserve and then a few other natural areas around here to see if they can document any more bumblebees or any more rusty patched. So I actually found a rusty patch this past summer right in the front lawn foraging on white clover. So And that's the picture down there below, and you can see a little pollen basket on it. So that was very exciting. One was found at Illinois and then also at Niabi Zoo. So it's great to see that the efforts of restoring natural areas and focusing on native plantings is making a difference. So to that, we have 4 minutes, but I can stay on a little bit longer if folks need to ask any questions, or you can make comments on any resources that you'd like me to share after the presentation, and I can get those sent out to Josh.
There's a chat, Amy. We have a question from Tegan.
Are bee houses and nests best placed in sun or shade? So the bee houses are, you're going to want to part sun, part shade is probably going to be best. You don't want to have them get too hot. So during that particular class, if you're coming to that, we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics, because you do want to have them be a little higher up. You don't want to have them too close to the ground. And that's because for the most part, that's going to just be like the best way to attract those mason and leafcutter bees. And it looks like we have a few more here. You're planning to install a pollinator garden in the spring or summer. What are some of the best native plants we can incorporate for our native bee friends? So I went over a few of those that are good, but I would definitely suggest checking out some of the packages and trays that they have at Prairie Moon Nursery and some of those other nurseries that I mentioned. Is there a good source for identifying bees and pollinators? Something like Sibley's Guide for Birds. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And Megachiday is a cool word. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here and I can show a couple of books that I really enjoy that are good for identifying. Just a moment here. So hello to everybody. So this is Pollinators of Native Plants, and this is by Heather Holm. She actually has a couple of Facebook pages. One of them is Pollinators on Native Plants, and then Bee Books by Heather Holm. And that's a really good resource. What's cool about this one is that it goes by habitat. So if you are in a prairie and you have identified whatever plant it is, you can actually go by and look up at the plant and see, okay, what could this be based on the plant that this insect is foraging on. So that would be a really good place to start. Otherwise, take pictures and upload them to iNaturalist. Honestly, that's a really super quick, easy way to do it. And you can get some pretty good photos on your phone. So I would suggest you could do that. Another good resource is Bumblebees of North America. I've got mine tabbed for all the native species. It can be hard because sometimes with our bumblebees, the females and the queens and the workers can all look very different. So sometimes you can't even identify these things down to the species without putting it underneath a microscope. But I don't worry about getting too detailed on that. But this is another good, really cool resource too. And it talks about some of the research methods that are being used to study bumblebees. All right, I think I have a couple more chats. Yeah, so looking for some resources on trees in particular. Yeah, I can absolutely, I'll make a note to share a list of trees. And I'll provide some other resources in case you weren't able to take notes about some of the places to buy plants. So, and we'll get those sent out to you. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'll stay on for another minute or two in case somebody does have questions. Otherwise, thanks for letting me present to you guys tonight. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. Great job. Thank you very much. And I'll give you a little applause here.
Thank
That
you.
was very
Yay.
informative.
Yay,
and
wonderful. Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in and taking time out of your evening to participate.
For
You
those
bet.
left,
Have a
we
good
look
one.
forward to the next couple presentations next week, and Amy, we'll be in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, great job.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.